Coming up on This Week in Computer Hardware, AMD RX 5600 XT beats NVIDIA 2060. That's quite a firmware update, people. Sonos drops support for older products, and so much mayhem is going to happen in phone voting. All that and more coming up next on Twitch. This Week in Computer Hardware is brought to you from LastPass Studios. Using the same password everywhere is a security nightmare waiting to happen. LastPass easily creates unique passwords for every site. Visit lastpass.com/twit.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust. This is Twit.
This is Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware, episode 550, recorded on January 23rd, 2020. BIOS updates. Boost it or brick it. This episode of This Week in Computer Hardware is brought to you by Zapier. Zapier connects all your business software and handles the work for you so you can focus on what matters most. Right now through the end of next month, go to zapier.com/twitch for your free 14-day trial. Welcome to Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware, Twitch weekly show that aims to bring you all the hardware news, whether it's mobile, console, desktop, or laptop. We are down, and today we are going to be all over and down on the Internet of Things, specifically Sonos, and there might be a little bit of carrier-based rage. But first, ladies and gentlemen, we should introduce Mr. Sebastian Peak. I'm Patrick Norton. Sebastian, joining us from PCPer.com, is not full of rage as I am, but is full of hot tips on the new 5600 series cards from AMD.
Yes.
Sir.
Because this was, hey, Patrick, it's good to be back with you here as I awkwardly transition to the first story. Yeah, we talked about this last week, I think, at CES. AMD, their announcements were probably the most interesting thing in the PC hardware space because they had information about this new crazy 64-core processor for $4,000. They also had, for the mainstream graphics segment, a new GPU announced, and not completely new. Essentially, this is a kind of a reduced version of the RX 5700. So this is the 5600 XT.
Right.
And of course, graphics companies do this. They create different configurations, slightly cut down configurations. So this is the same Navi 10 GPU that we have seen in the 5700 series. It has actually the same streaming processor count as the 5700. So these are both, essentially, they take a 5700 and they downclock it. But in addition to the lower clocks, they announced that this would only have 6 gigabytes of memory. And importantly, they were clocking the memory at a much lower speed, so it had a lower data rate. So we were only at a total of 12 gigabits per second of memory speed versus 14 with the 5700 series cards. So less and slower memory, much slower clocks. Like we're talking a game clock that would only boost an average of about 1375 megahertz versus 1625 with the 5700. And a max boost clock of only 1560 megahertz versus 1725. Everything else the same kind of like ROPS, texture units. I mean, so a lot of the same capabilities, but
those numbers are certainly, they sound kind of large, 10-15%. What's the actual impact on frames per second or the kind of the quality settings you can use on a GPU when you drop it down that much?
Well, you know, Patrick, I'm glad you asked that question because it would have been interesting to look at that difference, except just before launch, AMD emailed myself and all the other reviewers, and they said, hey, we have a new BIOS update we need you to use, which literally invalidated any previous benchmarks that we had. So I was lucky enough to have been sampled directly by AMD with the Sapphire Pulse card. And Sapphire was, I think, the first to get the new BIOS. So actually, a lot of the cards that will be out in the wild will already have this new BIOS. We'll get into that. The BIOS update, I'll just talk about it right now. It was huge because it took what felt like a combination of reduced hardware capabilities with the new card compared to a 5700 and intentional product segmentation, which is where they just, they figure out, okay, what's the gap we need to have to keep the value proposition but make it an attractive upgrade to move up to the next card. It kind of threw all that out the window in response to NVIDIA and said, okay, well, actually, hey, the hardware was capable of running a lot faster all along. Here's about a 200 megahertz upgrade in speed across the board. boost clocks, game clock, and faster memory data rate. So it turns out the memory that was on these boards from the very beginning was 14 gigabit per second memory, not 12. That was an artificial segmentation decision. And so the product, if you have the latest BIOS update installed, is far closer to a 5700 than it was when they announced it at CES. So there's that 10%. So it's literally a 10% jump, because I ended up doing some benchmarks before and after the BIOS update. But we're talking, let's see, before the BIOS update, if I scroll down to that section here, because I did all the benchmarking, and then there's a section in the review called the BIOS update impact in the content. And so I just quickly did Far Cry 5, which is a DirectX 11 game, and then Metro Exodus, which is a DirectX 12 game. And before the BIOS update, the 5600 XT was in Far Cry 5, which is a very like AMD friendly game. It's an AMD optimized game. Was actually slightly faster than an RTX 2060. This is a card that when it was announced at CES was supposed to compete with the GTX 1660 Ti. And the 2060 is a faster card than the Ti. So this is actually just a little bit faster in Far Cry 5. But then with the new BIOS, it goes from 75.5 frames per second average at 1440 Ultra to 84, which is a big jump. It's an 11% jump in average frames per second. And that comes very close to an RTX 2060 Super, which is only a couple of frames per second faster. So and then the same thing with Metro Exodus, only Metro Exodus, it was just a little bit faster than the 2060, but with the new BIOS, yeah, it's like the same story. It's only less than 2 frames per second separated between the 2060 Super and the XT with the new BIOS. So what they did was, across the board, that was not the case. Like you'll find more NVIDIA friendly games, like things like Final Fantasy 14 Shadowbringers, which I tested. Games like that NVIDIA tends to win because those are more optimized for NVIDIA. They have GameWorks features. That's where you'd still see an RTX 2060 eking out a win over this new 5600 XT. But it goes back and forth. And ultimately, more often than not, with the updated BIOS, this new 5600 XT was faster than a 2060. Non-overclocked 2060.
I will say, in NVIDIA's defense, you're looking at the better part of a 20% performance lead over that 5600 XT, but for Final Fantasy Shadowbringers. But this is also one of those things where, again, we've said this before, it is amazing what kind of performance improvement can be wrung out of a graphics card by optimizing the BIOS, by optimizing the game for the card, or more accurately optimizing the drivers for the card for the game. But this is also kind of nuts when you look at the swing where the card goes from 20% faster to 20% slower, depending on which game you're running, and how much money, for example, say maybe NVIDIA plowed into convincing this company to update the game or build the game around their drivers. Or feature set. That's that's pretty huge. But then getting World of Tanks Encore right back down there. Well, there's 97.0, 97.5 frames. That's
it's within the average.
Close.
Yeah, it's within the rounding error almost. Like it there's a plus minus with any of these tests. Although World of Tanks Encore, it's one of those standalone benchmarks. It's very consistent. If you run that over and over and over, you'll see results within a half frame per second every time on the same hardware. So it's interesting to see, like in certain games, they're virtually tied, the RTX 2060 and the 5600 XT with the BIOS update, where it would have been sitting down far closer to a 1660 Ti. And you have the reason they did this, the reason it has to now trade blows with the RTX 2060 is because after they announced their product, of course, longtime partner of NVIDIA, EVGA, announced their $299 RTX 2060, which initially is or was only selling for $279.99, specifically targeting the $279 price point that AMD set with their card. So we get the new card announcement from AMD. It seems kind of underwhelming. It's got less memory. It's slower memory, much lower clock speeds than a 5700. Right. And they're still charging $279 for it, which is the same price as a GTX 1660 Ti. And then, of course, the games that they showed on stage, they had a few performance charts, and these are all AMD optimized titles, of course. Why wouldn't you show that as AMD? And showing how you can get about 10% better performance at 1080 Ultra than NVIDIA at the same price point. NVIDIA dropping the price of the RTX 2060 like they did down to $300, then made AMD's announcement seem even more lackluster. And then the knockout punch, and that's EVGA's term because they called the new card the KO, saying that it was going to knock out the competition at $279. Yep, and there's the graphic straight from EVGA, right from their website. If you're watching the video, and so that basically AMD had to respond, and they could have responded with a price drop, and we expected that. You know, here at PC Pro, we were talking about a price drop of maybe about $20. That made sense to me. $259 when this hit the market. They did that with the 5700 launch. They dropped the price by $50 for the 5700 XT before it launched. But instead of eating into their margins and lowering the price, they just made it faster. They said, hey, we have all this untapped potential. And honestly, I had been given advanced not warning, but I was sort of tipped off by AMD that, hey, you know, this product has quite a bit of overclocking headroom. And that 10% number, I think, is what was floated out there is, hey, you can overclock this quite a bit. And that was going to be part of the review. And when they released this BIOS update instead, there's your overclocking headroom basically pre-applied. And it does raise the TDP of the card by about 10 watts from 150 to 160 in its performance BIOS mode. Because a lot of these cards are going to have two BIOS modes on a little switch on the PCB.
Right.
Which, by the way, footnote, does make the process of flashing the BIOS a little bit less hairy, because if something goes horribly, horribly wrong and you lose power in the middle of flashing this to get the faster speeds, then you can always switch it over to position 2 and your card isn't bricked anymore. So that was nice. But even with the BIOS update applied in the performance mode, this card had exactly the same power draw as an RTX 2060 under load. I found that interesting. This test platform with both the RTX 2060 Founders Edition that we tested and this 5600 XT after the BIOS update was applied, both drew exactly 235 watts from the wall in the same gaming load with the same processor. Everything else is the same. So that's pretty fascinating. It's like they absolutely targeted the RTX 2060 here, just like they had initially positioned the card to be a little bit faster than a 1660 Ti. Then here they obviously in their labs, they looked at what they had to do as far as clock speeds, total graphics power, everything else to match or exceed an RTX 2060, and they did it. Although it is interesting to see that power draw at 235 and consider that the RTX 2060 is on a 12 nanometer process and this is 7, but AMD has definitely focused more on the performance aspect of the 7 nanometer drop than on power savings with their GPUs anyway. So they push it as far as they possibly can to get higher clocks, and that's just the result. Like the voltage is a little bit higher and the power draw is a little bit higher. But hey, in the end, 235 watts, that's total power draw, including the processor, including the memory, and the overhead of an 80 plus gold power supply. So you're only getting, 90 or so % of that power. But overall, it went from a review where I would have said, not that exciting, like with the RX 5500 XT review before this. It's okay. I would like it a lot more if it was cheaper. And then the review suddenly becomes, wow, it's got 10% better performance after I flashed it, and you don't have to do anything else. And it's trading blows with a more expensive card, because that 279 number with the RTX 2060 KO, that's pretty much unobtainable. I don't know if you can be notified and buy it directly from EVGA at that price or not. Last I checked, it was out of stock. And the least expensive one that you could actually buy was, I think, $310. somewhere in the 310 to 320 range. So if you buy one of these RX 5700 or 5600 XTs somewhere, and every company is offering BIOS updates, that was the next thing on the list. Just kind of the availability of those updates, where to get them. They're all offered by the vendors. PC Games N had a nice story up that they actually put up with the launch and have been updating it consistently with every card and the links to the official BIOS updates from those vendors. So, ASRock and Sapphire and all Power Color and all the card companies out there with RX 5600 XTs that have been released, and where to get their official update. And honestly, AMD's update tool for these is pretty easy to use. It's Windows based. You can put, if you really want to, you can put it on a floppy, and you can, or a USB drive, and put like free DOS on it, boot up your system and do command line, which, a couple years ago, that's how we were updating BIOS on graphics cards, was booted into a command line interface. And
I know that feeling.
Type. Yeah. Don't you miss typing in ROM names like 2Y614011?
It was the 13 to 15 letter and number ones where you'd be typing and typing and typing and typing and typing.
And then get one of the characters wrong and have it, invalid. What do you mean invalid? Or you type it all in and you have the wrong BIOS, and it's just like invalid product. So this is simply open up a little window, and you hit like find and locate the new ROM file, and then hit apply. And I was still a little scared during the process, but it flashed just fine and no complaints. So if you're on Linux, though, if you're on another operating system, then you can make yourself a bootable free DOS flash drive and do it that way, the old-fashioned way.
I don't know. It reminds me of, you remember buying like a game and then installing the CDs and then basically downloading an even larger file that was the actual functioning game that they didn't put in the box that they shipped to you. I'm getting a little old school now.
Well, and then there's the transitional period where you would still buy the physical box in the store, take it home, and then if you'd read the fine print, it said that there was nothing in the box. It was just a download code. So, I mean, if you bought one of these cards, you're actually physically getting a card that does work. It's just not as fast.
This is good.
You update it. But it's a free update. It's not like they said, hey, for $20, you can unlock greater performance in this. Not that we've ever seen a company ever sell update cards to make processors faster after they sold them.
Well, it's odd for me to look at this. I mean, listening to your description is essentially, we shipped a card at a price point to compete with this thing, and then they dropped the price in this thing, or at least one company did. So we decided to overclock the card because there was so much thermal room in the TDP for us to play with, so that it's actually shipping in the overclocked version that we could have shipped you in the first place for the same amount of money, but didn't want to because we have 17 cards in our stack.
Right. Well, they don't have as many as NVIDIA. If this was NVIDIA, they would just release, a TI Super GTX KO. There's always some extra letters to add to the end of the name. And actually, it's funny because Steve at Gamers Nexus, there's a video up. I think it came up last night on his YouTube channel, which they took off the cooler and looked at this. And apparently, after asking some questions, they were able to determine that the GPU in EVGA's 2060 KO is a repurposed GTX or RTX 2080 GPU. And of course, that GPU was discontinued when the 2080 Super came out. So I don't know if these are defective 2080 dies that are then being partially fused off.
Inventory, or some of NVIDIA's old inventory.
Right. So that's interesting because NVIDIA has quite a bit of resources, let's put it that way. And if they want to, they can just repurpose an older product and pick a price point to sell it at, and they have the partners to get it out there and advertise it. And it's a interesting position to be in. But the AMD doesn't have that, and now they have exactly 4 products in this current stack with Navi. So they have the 5500 XT, 5600 XT, which is really Sorry to talk over you. I'm just thinking, because if they hadn't done this BIOS update, they could have released this faster version as an XT. Like the fact that they came out with this and called it an XT is the faster version, essentially. Maybe higher core count They could have had a 5600 and then later had a 5600 XT for $10 or $20 more, just like NVIDIA does a card and then a TI version of the card, 1600, 1600 Ti, and then 1600 series, 1660 Ti, 1660 Super, and there's the 1660. Then there's the 1650, but there's also the 1650 Super, and it's just they fill in so many different. We've talked about this a lot in the last year. They have literally a card for every $10. So.
Let it go.
AMD lost a chance to further segment their product stack by just making this faster, is what I'm trying to say.
They'll come out with another card in a couple of weeks and fix that problem. Maybe
Please
2,
no.
maybe 3. So normally I don't really get excited about Board of Supervisor elections. I almost get excited about them in the community I'm living in because, your supervisors directly impact the quality of life in your city or your town or wherever you happen to be living, if you have a Board of Supervisors. Or maybe just because you want to see who's going to be arguing with the mayor for the next several years. I can, however, name a Board of Supervisor election that has just guaranteed that it will get national, if not international, attention, which is the King Conservation District, which is essentially Seattle, the Seattle area. And NPR's Morning Edition reported this morning that, quote, Seattle area voters to vote by smartphone in first for U.S. elections. And this is kind of a big deal, right? So this is an area that covers approximately 1.2 million voters. It'll probably be a lot less. NPR noted that the King Conservation District, i.e. the greater Seattle area, has, quote, in past years drawn less than 1% of the eligible population to the ballot box, at least for the supervisors' elections, which is to say not many people. One of the things I particularly love about this article is that it points out that not just security experts, but the U.S. Senate is down on the idea of using phones for elections. And it's interesting, right? Whenever you have the U.S. Senate, which has never really been known for its technical expertise, agreeing with security experts, it's always a curious and slightly unsettling thing. They quoted Duncan Buell, who's a comp sci prof at the University of South Carolina, and his specialization is election technology. And he said, he told NPR, quote, there is a firm consensus in the cybersecurity community that mobile voting on a smartphone is a really stupid idea. I don't know that I've run across a cybersecurity experts whose mortgages are not paid by a mobile voting company who thinks it's a good idea. Basically, or let me make that clear. He's basically saying any security expert who thinks voting via cell phone is a good idea is essentially working for a mobile voting company. So Democracy Live kind of was looking at how this was going to work. You use your name, your birth date, you log into a web portal through the internet browser on your phone. And then they verify their submission of the ballot. They sign a signature. Quote, Finney says election officials in Washington are adept at signature verification because the state votes entirely by mail. That will be the way people are caught if they log into the system under false pretenses and try to vote as someone else. So, and then they're going to print out the ballots. The King County Election Officials Office, or the King County Elections Office, is going to print out the ballots, and the ones that match voter signatures will be counted. So,
interesting. So
yeah,
maybe a little bit more sophisticated to game the system then, but not impossible.
Right. Yeah, maybe even not even particularly difficult, depending on how it's implemented. I'm gonna quote Miles Parks from NPR.org. Where did it go? While advocates say this creates an auditable paper trail, many security experts say that because the ballots cross the internet before they are printed, any subsequent audits on them would be moot. If a cyber attack occurred, an audit could essentially require double-checking ballots that may have already been altered. So The first question is, where do they keep the records of the signatures and how secure is that database? Or how likely are they to catch people who have not voted before, whose information is being spoofed, or. It's going to be interesting. It's going to gather a lot of attention. It was also notable to me, we're not a politics or an election podcast here by any stretch of the imagination, but this is another case where more of your life is potentially moving on to a smartphone. Or a case where your hardware and how it is employed could radically alter things in your community. And it's in a day and an age where there's rarely enough time or space in many communities to vote. This would make voting much, much more accessible. ... But that's kind of a moot point if it isn't very secure.
Yeah, I mean, but we've talked about before the fact that so many people do just about everything on a smartphone, and maybe not our audience so much. And we've said things, or I have said things like this before, or on my podcast, where we talk about it almost sounds like we're disparaging people who use PCs, or at least sometimes I may come across that way. But I'm just talking about the most mainstream, the people who are not enthusiasts, who don't play PC games at all, and their idea of gaming is playing something on a phone, where they're playing Yahtzee with their friends on their smartphones. And if it's like my family, there's no one in my family who does anything on a computer at all. I'm the only one. It's my mom, my sister, my wife, any of her friends, her sister, like anybody I can think of right now. They do everything on a smartphone. The only divide is whether they're on the Android side of things or if they have an iPhone. That's literally the only difference. But everything is done on a phone. And anytime somebody wants something printed or actually needs to do some real work, guess who gets a text message? So it's like, oh, hey, can you print this for me? And it's my job to do that because I have computers and I have a laser printer and stuff. And I know how to do these things. But if something needs to be scanned, if something needs to be printed, or if there's an application that they need that isn't on a phone, I'm that resource for them. So it's just, if voting comes to their phone, there's something that like, oh, cool, it's an app. And they'll go through whatever process they have to go through to validate it. And they would be very happy with that.
We wait with bated breath. I for one, never thought I would be excited about watching a supervisor election in Seattle. But
hey, you know what? I'm going to give you, I'll be honest with you. I'm not. I'm still not. Even with the technological ramifications of it, city council or some kind of like local controller, I don't care about that election. I'm sorry.
You say that now.
Yeah, that's true. Wait till I get a few more gray hairs and I might start to care.
This episode of This Week in Computer Hardware is brought to you by Zapier. Zapier connects all your business software and handles the work for you so you can focus on what matters most to you. Do you want to sit around messing about with things, or do you want them to just go to work? Look, growing a business is hard. You don't want to be wasting hours every day moving data from emails to spreadsheets to CRM to wherever you need it to go. It should just happen, right? And that's where Zapier can help. Zapier has over 1,500 apps and is the easiest way to automate your work, so you can focus on what matters most, connecting your business software to engage your leads instantly, to automatically import new customers, to notify your team about opportunities. And part of that is that Zapier is customizable. They support multi-step zaps, so the possibilities are virtually endless. You string it from thing to thing to thing till the things build the sales you need to keep growing your business and keep everybody happy. It's not painful, right? You can build the solution you need in minutes. No more wasting your time on tasks that you know could be automated, because that's exactly what Zapier was built to do. Now, just go to Zapier.com/twitch. You connect the apps you use most. You let Zapier take it from there. Best of all, it's easy to build the exact solution you need in minutes without writing code or asking a developer for help. And it's sometimes it's nice not to have to go through the whole development process to do something you can do by clicking 3 or 4 times. Join more than 4.5 million people who are saving an average of 40 hours per month by using Zapier. Seriously, this is amazing, right? Make more time to grow your business right now through the end of the month. Try Zapier free by going to Zapier.com/TWICH. That's Zapier, ZAPIER.com/Twitch for your free 14-day trial. Zapier.com/Twitch. And we want to thank Zapier for their support of This Week in Computer Hardware. I like making things easy. I like automation that isn't emotionally traumatic to set up. I also like it if you're watching the video when I sit up tall and I actually put my head in the part of the frame where it's supposed to be. Microsoft started rolling out developer kits and emulators for its dual-screen Surface Duo Android phone and Windows 10X-based Surface Neo. If you have been waiting for Microsoft's return to phones by way of Android, or you're just excited to see more dual-screen Android devices, you can officially get excited now.
Hey, but this is the right kind of dual screen. This is the kind of dual screen with a pronounced bezel and hinge that I'm excited about this because the dev kit going out tells me people are going to be creating software that effectively uses both screens, and B, this is getting closer to realization where they're getting the developer support so that when this product launches, they have apps that actually make use of what this can do instead of simply being a way to multitask, which is also great. Even if the only thing you ever do with this is have YouTube playing on one side and, doing some sort of productivity on the other side, like email or surfing the web, I guess, if that's considered productive for research purposes. At the same time, because right now to do that on a mobile device, you have things like picture-in-picture on larger Android phones where you can have one app either floating in a little window off to whatever corner of the screen you want to put it, or you might be able to do a split screen depending on your phone. But, a split screen on a 6-inch device is not ideal. And this ushers in a completely different kind of productivity experience on a very small device where you essentially have the real estate of a laptop display on something that folds up to half the size of your laptop and is significantly slimmer and lighter. And anyone who's tried to use an Android tablet for productivity in the past, I admire you if you were able to do it effectively. I remember reviewing a product from Dell a few years ago it looked like a laptop, but it was Android powered, and I was stuck looking for good Android tablet apps, which just were not even in the same league as tablet apps on the iPad at the time. This was a few years ago. So, but again, if developers are actually trying to create, especially business-oriented applications for this device, then it could be great, because anyone who's used mobile-based operating systems know that the power management stuff is better than it is in Windows. You could potentially have a device that has significantly longer battery life. And if it's doing all the same tasks, the only thing you're missing is a physical keyboard, which of course there will be solutions for that. I'm sure Microsoft will have their own keyboard accessory for this, but
we'll see.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just thought it was interesting to just kind of note, just to remind everybody that Microsoft is getting their Android on. Josh did a write-up on this in PC Per this week, and this is an announcement about SONOS legacy versus modern products. And if you're wondering what that means, if you're a Sonos enthusiast, and I'll just wave my hand in the air there, or if you're frustrated with Sonos, I'll just wave my hand in the air there. They are classifying their products into two groups, legacy and modern. The modern products, of course, will continue to get regular software updates. And it's interesting. There's a kind of a list of the modern products and the legacy products, the Bridge, the Connect, made from 2011 to 2015, the Connect Amp, which was made from, or the ones that were made between 2011 and 2015, because they continue to make the Connect and the Connect Amp, in 2016 and later, right, until they came up with the Sonos Amp, for example, that came out at the tail end of 2018. The first gen Play 5, which I have, and then a list of the ZP 80, 90, 100, 120, which are fairly old. But it was interesting because a lot of these products, in some cases, if you bought a Connect amp or a Connect in 2015, you're going to be profoundly pissed off because it's essentially a 4-year-old, 5-year-old product at this point. if you own a Play 5, a Gen 1 Play 5 like I do, okay, that's a 10-year-old product. And the reason I'm bringing this up is, this is Sonos claims that they cannot get, for a lot of their partners, and there's over 100 streaming partners that Sonos works with at this point, Spotify, Tidal, these would be the ones you might think about first, Audible, something like that. But apparently the APIs and software are getting so complicated that they claim a lot of these products, these 8-10-year-old products, which were spec'd with 8 to 10-year-old chips, are at the edge of their capabilities at this point, and they can no longer kind of keep them running and or deliver the customer or the user experience that you want. And it's frustrating would be one word for it if you own these products, because they still sound fantastic. They still work extremely well. They still seem to have, for all intents and purposes, no delay when you start the product. It's something we're probably going to see more and more of for these sort of single-use devices. The Register got really intense about this. Thomas Claiborne over at the register.co.uk. And first of all, like a lot of sites, the idea that if all of my stuff is modern, like for example, apparently my Play 3 is new enough, Sonos amp is new enough. If you have the Play 1 speakers, which is what we've done a ton of our listening on, those all have new enough processors to keep moving forward. However, the one Play 5 we had, which was perfectly adequate and did a great job in our kitchen, would no longer received updates, and B, leaving it in our network would prevent us from using any of the speakers in our network from getting updated. And so Sonos says they're going to give you the ability to quarantine your legacy gear. The part of the reason I mentioned the Register article is because they pulled out some, I think it was a Register article that pulled out some quotes. Oh, there it is. There we go. In their Q4 2019 10K, the financial filings, where Sonos said, quote, "We expect that in the near term, this backwards compatibility will no longer be practical or cost effective, and we may decrease or discontinue service for our older products. If we no longer provide extensive backward capability for our products, we may damage our relationship with our existing customers, as well as our reputation, brand loyalty, and ability to attract new customers." This is a little frustrating, right? Because, they're blunt. This is a complicated thing to keep running, right? 100 streaming services, voice assistants, control options. And I'm really curious. I'm going to give Sonos the benefit of the doubt, because when you think about it, if somebody's speccing a product where the engineering was set in place 8 years ago, 2010, that is a pretty aged chipset by modern standards. And if you've spent a lot of time watching streaming audio services, even over the last few years, you'll notice that they keep getting more and more complicated, more and more messy, and seem to be doing more and more things other than simply allowing you to play and stream music. So I'm going to give Sonos the benefit of the doubt here and suggest that they actually can no longer effectively support their older products, and not that they want to increase the $1 billion in revenue they make annually by forcing their original customer base to upgrade to newer products. This is challenging.
I'll take the less diplomatic view of this. Think about this. Sonos, we talked about this fairly recently. They're the company that late last year were offering 30% off coupons. Yep. 30% off coupons in exchange for intentionally bricking and sending back to Sonos or taking to a recycling center your existing Sonos equipment. So there has been this trajectory with the company of, okay, we have to force obsolescence with these things because people are retaining their stuff at alarming rates for us. So we need them to brick their stuff to get a coupon to buy new stuff. Or how about this? Brilliant move. Because I can see if older older products, and you talked about chipsets, that's absolutely valid when you talk about things like enhanced, voice capabilities and that sort of thing. Because these things, they come out, they have different kind of chipsets in them, different capabilities, multiple microphone arrays, all this stuff to manage, the processing that has to take place on board the device. Those needs might go up, sure. However, unless the technology that it provides the sort of interconnection between these devices in your home changes, if it's using the same wireless standard to go from amplifier to speaker, and if a lot of the stuff that happens offline is the same, then why would you force people to quarantine off, say, a set of speakers that are in the kitchen, when those could just have reduced functionality? Like, hey, those, you can't use voice control on these older products now, but they'll have a reduced functionality. Like, failure to upgrade will reduce functionality on your network or something like that. Like, a pair of speakers at the end of the day is a pair of speakers, and until they're going to a completely different technology, either to connect them or because the audio has changed, which is not happening. It's not like they're going to 32-bit, 384 kilohertz, and the old stuff just doesn't support that natively because it could only go up to 24-bit 44.1. That's ludicrous. And it's not like human hearing has evolved to the point where those speakers can no longer produce sounds that human beings can interpret. I
don't think anybody's questioning they'll play your MP3 files or your WAV files or your lossless FLAC files. I think what they're claiming is that it's interesting, right? Because they're able to do a fairly sophisticated amount of DSP on the older devices, right? You can correct your room by walking around with your iPhone device. You can have the speaker tuned to deal with some of the issues in the physical room you're in. I think I'm curious, right? I'm torn, right? Because hey, they went public last year. They're a publicly owned company. They need to maximize shareholder revenue, and they want to do whatever they need to do that because that's the way it works. On the flip side, I can also think that in terms of dealing with some of these apps, as the streaming apps get more onerous, that may be more challenging. Or there's probably somewhere in between where they're like, we could probably make it work, but screw it, let's force them to buy new stuff. It's frustrating.
And the argument that it's not worth us putting resources into older products that by this point are 9+ years old in some cases, that makes sense from a business standpoint. I just think that some of this is probably just doing what they think they can get away with to try to force obsolescence of some of these products that technically would still work even without receiving the latest software updates. It's right. I bet if there was some new technology, some new codec that came down, like MQA, which I don't know how much traction that has, but that was the darling of the audiophile world a couple years ago. So say some new codec happens and it doesn't support it without a software update, and they withhold the software update. We've gotten used to that. We've gotten used to, right? Technically you could probably put the latest version of Android on this device, but Samsung is not going to provide it, or LG isn't going to provide it, and you have to buy a new phone if you want this new feature. Or when Apple comes out with a new feature that absolutely would work on older phones, but they've withheld it to sell new hardware, and it would take jailbreaking your old phone to get the feature enabled on it, then you kind of see. But Apple, though, they come out with these new features that they say are they require the new hardware. Well, they require the new hardware to do it maybe as fast or as well, but it's not like you're going to update your iPhone 6 and suddenly have the slow fees and low light camera mode, which is just an extended shutter. But they want you to buy the new hardware. So if you want that stuff, you buy the iPhone 11 you saw on the TV ad that shows those features, even though it's not technically something that cannot be done by a multi-core processor, memory, camera, DSP, et cetera, et cetera. So some of this stuff is artificial, some of it's real. I just find it kind of funny because we're talking about 2-channel music. And yes, there's the DSP. I forgot about room correction. But a lot of that stuff I think is offloaded. Some of the things that are happening, like the processing and that sort of thing, aren't happening on the smartphone side.
Right.
I don't know. I don't know enough to have anything but suspicions about this, I guess. It just reminds us a lot. Jeremy was talking about this at PC Fur last night, that it feels a lot like what Logitech did with the Harmony remotes, where they received so much backlash over that they sort of reinstated, and then of course the next year had pretty much killed it because they withdrew the app. So then there was no actual software support for these things. So it feels kind of like that.
It does. We won't go into that one again because then there will be out and outrage. Man, I was also laughing. Speaking of firmware and updates and mayhem, I had a MiFi 8000 that's connected to the Sprint's network, and it's been really interesting because it had glitched. Factory boot wouldn't fix it. There's nowhere, there's essentially no other way to firmware update. It wouldn't update. Basically there's the actual physical firmware, and there's sort of a provisioning firmware or provisioning load you can put onto it. Neither one of those would complete a load. And I'm on my second tech support call. The first tech support call, I was supposed to get a call back from them, never got the call back. I called the tech support a second time, and essentially they're like, okay, this is one of our towers near where you are in South Dakota, and can you go to this tower and then try to restart the thing to see if it will actually connect to the tower, because you're in an extended area, apparently, it turns out. Thankfully, so I literally drive to the sort of outskirts of Rapid City. I'm down at the end of a dirt street, parked across from a mobile security guy that's protecting what I presume is a reasonably recently emptied building and lot, and feeling the hairy eyeball from security as I go to the end of this dirt road and park my truck around 50 yards from a cell tower, and then sort of reboot this thing to see if it can provision itself directly from Sprint. First it won't, but then it will do the update for the basic file I need. Then I go around and restart it, and actually connects to the network for the first time in several days. And then I go to run it. And so this has been weird, but it's running now, so I'm happy. And then I throw a speed test at it. And and I got to say, in Sprint's credit, all of their customer service agents were super patient, and they didn't have a lot to work with, but they worked with what they did. And essentially, literally, in order to get this normally highly functioning hotspot to work, okay, I got to drive next to a tower. It's fine. So I'm sitting next to the tower. So, I'm literally 50 yards from the tower. And the first time to run the speed test, I get 0 as an upload speed and 4 megabytes down, which is considerably lower than the service I'm used to getting from Sprint. And then I restart it, and okay, I'm on the phone with tech support. And I get 0.17 as an upload speed, and 4 megabits down, which I think is pretty much useless when you have a 780 millisecond ping time, and you're literally watching, either not being able to download a web page because your request isn't going up to the servers, or the end result, as it turns out, is, I don't know, do we have that Sprint map? And this has been something we've been talking about on and off for a couple of years. So this is what Sprint's coverage looks like in the United States. And I may mention, look at that. Look at all of that coverage. Isn't that amazing? What a glorious network we have here. And if you start clicking in on this, you'll notice, especially in parts of the West, it magically goes from total coverage. Look at all that coverage. Look at that coverage. Oh, all that gray is now roaming. And if you scroll over to the urban areas to the right, you'll probably notice, if you get lucky, if your internet connection is streaming this, if you're watching the video, you'll probably notice it says extended 4G LTE, which is kind of a yellow, which looks like the 4G LTE yellow, with hash marks on it, or left to right kind of diagonal lines across it. And that turns out to be extended 4G LTE roaming, extended 4G LTE, which turns out to be roaming, but it's not considered roaming. It's one of their partners, and it's taken out of your regular Sprint coverage. It's not something where you have, like, in my case, like 100 megabytes, and then they freak out or shut your account down or start making you pay or whatever they do. But essentially, you're allowed to, most carriers these days, you have a very, very small amount of roaming you're allowed to use without penalties or frustration from the carrier. And in this case, what I thought would be 4G LTE, because I looked at the map and didn't drill down. Now I know to drill down all the time to the actual physical area. It turns out that 0 to 0.17 megabit up and 4 down is considered perfectly acceptable within the parameters of extended 4G LTE coverage from Sprint. And immediately, as I'm trying not to start screaming out of frustration on the phone, all I can think of is this is just like unlimited data, where you have 20 or 30 megabytes of data, and then you get throttled to what is effectively an unusable 128 kilobits per second. Because if you've ever tried to load a web page over a mobile connection that's being throttled, you will discover that 128 kilobits per second, which would have been absolutely fantastic in 2008 or 2009, is utterly unusable, even to load web pages and sometimes even things like Gmail and Facebook in 2019. So, RTFD, RTFM, and make sure if you're using a coverage map or another tool like that, that you drill down as far as you can, because the map, as they say, is not the ground, or in this case, the coverage. And the coverage you get may be a fancy marketing term for something that is barely usable. Oh, what a joy it is to work with the modern carriers. Lovely creatures they are. Lovely
this
creatures.
Perfectly illustrates the point I think I was trying to make months ago. We were talking about 5G, and we've talked about 5G a lot. But I would rather have the entire country blanketed in very high-quality, reliable LTE before we worry about things like 5G in big markets. Because as you've discovered, and I've been to places in that area of the country. My wife and I drove to Montana together when my sister-in-law was still living there. And there were parts of the country where there's just nothing, or where there's a tower close enough to provide you with what looks like coverage on a map. But when you actually zoom in, you see, oh, that's actually a few miles that way, and I'm on this country road going across the state of Montana, and there's just absolutely nothing for 100 miles in every direction, including cell service. So it would be nice if we just had more reliable coverage, and it doesn't have to be super fast. Well, how about 5 megabits up and down? I don't need 20. I don't need something like that, but something usable, because you get into the kilobits per second range, and the modern web doesn't like that anymore. I'm not that old, but I'm old enough to remember when my 768 kilobit per second cable internet connection that I was paying $50 to $60 a month for was the fastest thing I'd ever experienced in my life. And the idea of getting over a megabit per second was just unthinkable. And, this is around 2000, 2001 or something.
Not so much these days.
Certainly better than my 38.6 that I ever got from my, conceivably 56K modem that I think the fastest modem connection I ever saw in my life was like 50, 52. But,
well, I just want to give a shout out to the patient, if frustrated people in Sonos Tech Support. When I say frustrated, I mean frustrated by the lack of tools or resources they're given, or the fact that they have to explain to somebody that, no, that's extended 4G LTE. And it's like, and when you ask them enough questions, they finally basically say, well, yeah, it's roaming, but it's roaming that doesn't count against your thing. Like, so, extended LTE. Extended 4G LTE may actually be 3G covered or deprecated 4G coverage, and depending on our partnership agreement or whatever. I don't know. I find the mobile carriers to be frustrating, if not irritating, but not going to change anytime soon, I would imagine. But I don't know. It's been interesting to watch. It's been curious, right? It's early in 2020. We've already seen hardware being killed off, or just, I don't know. There's moments when I look at what's considered kind of standard, just standard procedure in terms of the relationship to truth in the hardware industry or the software industry or the tech industry, and I'm a little disappointed. It may also be just impacting me more directly, but we'll see. We'll see what the rest of 2020 holds. So, anything positive you can spin on this? Any delightful stories coming up on PCPer.com that you can tease, or should we just end it on a low and cranky note?
I don't know. It's getting pretty dark. That's for sure. And I feel like we're getting older quickly, and we're getting kind of inflexible. It's like that moment in Star Trek VI where Spock and Kirk are talking in Spock's quarters, and he says, "Have we become so old and inflexible that we are," and other words that I've forgotten because I can't remember the exact quote, but it's at some point I have to sort of reflect and say, okay, I'm cranky about this because I'm used to something else. Like I hit the power button on my amplifier and my speakers are now available, and I can play music from my CD player that's connected to it with RCA cables, or my turntable that's a couple of feet away, or connect it with a Y cable to my digital audio player. And all of this stuff is just beyond what any 13-year-old kid would do, which is literally play music out loud with a smartphone. What's that?
No, so nothing makes me feel young quite like hearing you talk about your audio setup.
Yeah, I'm very old school when it comes to this stuff. It's all
the fact that you still use a CD player. It just makes me cringe every time you say that.
I have so many CDs. I was cleaning recently and trying to find. I was actually missing something.
The data off of them.
I know.
Put it on a hard drive.
It's so daunting of a task, and a lot of people have gone down this road. I have more Blu-rays than I thought I had, because there was a period of time where I was buying a movie. Like my wife and I would go out shopping and I'm like, hey, we should watch this movie. And I wasn't the kind of person who was paying for streaming services. I just bought a Blu-ray or a DVD when I wanted to watch something. And we had Netflix, but it seemed like everything I ever wanted to watch wasn't on Netflix because they kept on getting rid of the old catalog titles and stuff. And I like old movies too, and you just couldn't find those on there. And I didn't want to get Turner Classic Movies just to watch the occasional old film. So it was, okay, well, I'll buy another Blu-ray. And so it turns out I have several totes of Blu-rays I didn't even know I had. And many on the shelf. And then many of them, unfortunately, have never even been opened because I never had the time to watch the movie after I bought it. And I'm thinking about what it would take to actually get all of these digitized and with a level of quality that I'm willing to watch, because I'm a snob when it comes to video quality, and that's why I was buying Blu-rays to begin with. And then I think about the CDs, and that's overwhelming because there are stacks and stacks of CDs, and like just the Rudy Van Gelder remaster Blue Note CDs I have total about 80. And then we get into all the other stuff, and just I have a lot of jazz and classical on CD, and then I have, we won't get into the record collection, which is one of those things that kind of spiraled out of control a few years ago. But yeah, to me, it's a very physical thing. Like you pick up a album and you put it on and you listen to it. And I think for a lot of people, it's just I have Spotify or some other streaming service and I play it. And if my phone isn't producing enough volume on its own, I wirelessly connect it to a battery-powered Bluetooth speaker, and that's good enough for me. So, in fact, I'm the only person I know who even has a stereo anymore, like what used to be called a hi-fi or a stereo. No one else has this unless it's a living room setup. And the only thing they use it for is watching TV, and all they watch is streaming stuff. So it's just, nobody that I know listens to anything uncompressed. Nobody watches anything better than 5 to 10 megabit streaming. So
there you have
I realize that it's me. I'm the problem.
No, you're not the problem. You're just one of the many answers to the problem. I use all the streaming services, and I still own Blu-rays or acquire Blu-rays because when I want the best possible experience, it's vastly better on a Blu-ray than it is on a streaming service. Although I will say part of the problem with that is having spent so much quality time with Robert Heron, I am vastly more attuned to issues in compression or color fidelity that are created by streaming. In any case, if you're not cheered up by now, well, there's always next week, ladies and gentlemen, because you're listening to This Week in Computer Hardware. We call it Twitch. You can find all the information on how to subscribe, assuming you're not, sobbing and contemplating moving to your retirement hut far out of the range of internet technology. On a hill, my wife in the background has just thrust her arms up in the air with the victory sign, with the idea of being away from the internet, which is a sign that we should probably make her close her Facebook account before she finds out any more depressing stories about kittens in Alabama. It's an invention, by the way. As far as I know, all of the kittens in Alabama are fine. There's no reason to call home or panic. But I was going to tell you about twit.tv/TWICH, which is the website where you can get information on how to subscribe. You can get all the older episodes, the audio, the video, or just go to your favorite podcatcher and search for This Week in Computer Hardware. Sebastian Peak is the man with the aging media collection.
That's what I do. I run agingmediacollection.com.
I think you should find that immediately. And you can find more of him over at PCPer.com. I'm Patrick Norton, and you can find more of me over at avxl.com. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we want to remind you that Twitch, TWICH at twit.tv, is the email address if you want to ask us a hardware question. We should have a couple of those queued up for you next week. But right now, thank you so much for listening or watching. I'm Patrick Norton.
And I'm Sebastian Peak.
We'll catch you next week on Twitch.